was so wonderful when we had our event at UWC. The famous and lovely poet Diane Ferris came, and she wrote a poem for the occasion. And the last line, and we didn't brief her. We just said, thank you so much for coming. We thought she'll just read any of her poems, and we didn't even know that she's going to write a new poem. But she wrote a poem, and the sort of phrase, the last phrase of the poem was, this is not a celebration, it is an accusation. And I thought, wow, this was so, it was almost uncanny that she just immediately sort of picked up on, you know, what at least I intended with the day. So of course, not to say that there's nothing to celebrate. I mean, in the same way, when we talk about, you know, so South Africa being a young democracy, and we sometimes tend to say nothing has changed. And I don't think that's true. And the same, of course, can be said about women. A lot has changed.
So, conversation is between us here. So, Prof Van Marle, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about women in the legal profession. We celebrate 100 years of women in law this year in South Africa. We've come a long way, and today I want us to reflect on your journey as a woman in the legal profession. So let's start at the beginning. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much. So I'm originally from the Gauteng province, from Pretoria. I studied there, undergraduate and graduate, and I worked at the University of Pretoria for many years. I'm an academic, and I've been an academic all my life. So in a way, I never left the university, so I never practiced. I've always taught. I think from a very young age, I knew that is where I'll end up. I love reading, I like books, I like ideas, I like reading, I like writing. I think what was important in my academic journey is that I started out thinking that research will be my first love and it will stay there. But throughout the years, I realized the importance of teaching and that I really get inspiration from my students. So in a way, now I'll say my research and my teaching are probably on the same level. So I think that's me. I'm happy to be at the University of the Western Cape. I only started in August last year. I always had my eye on this space as a very interesting space, the role that the university played during the struggle. I'm still with one foot in Bloemfontein because moving from Pretoria, I had a few years at the University of the Free State, but I'm slowly moving towards living in Cape Town permanently.
Thank you, Prof Van Marle. So let's start into that academic career that you have so much passion for. So you hold several degrees. You have an BLC, a LLC, LLB, a LLM, and a LLD. You have a fascination for the study of law. Why did you choose a career in academia specializing in law?
So I can be honest and say that law was not my very first choice. I was interested in philosophy and history and language and ideas. And I think I was considering studying languages, also specifically journalism. I was a teenager in the mid-80s during states of emergency, and I wanted to pursue something where I felt I could make a contribution. And towards the late 80s, newspapers like Mail and Guardian and also Die Vrye Weekblad came out, and as a young person, that's what I felt I had to do. But my father said, no, you need to study at the closest university, and at that stage, UP didn't offer law. But he, I think, was a kind of a feminist without realizing. He wanted me to obtain a professional degree. So I ended up studying law. And I think it was in my third year when I did legal philosophy or jurisprudence that I started realizing that law might be the right space for me to be in. I realized the potential to pursue ideas and critical ideas and the possibility then of making a contribution through a life in academia. So yes, and then I suppose after my 2 undergrad degrees, I did a master's where I focused on pornography, because that was just in the first year of the interim constitution. I did my master's 1994, 1995, and it struck me that there was a big shift to address, at least institutionally, we'll talk about the success or the failures just now. There was a shift to address many of the past injustices. But in terms of women, it was never at the forefront. And of course, after so many years of suppression, things started opening up, and we ended up being able to buy pornography in cafes and shops. So I was very concerned about that and the link between pornography and sexual violence. So my master's focused on pornography. And then later on, my doctorate was from 1996 onwards, I focused on what was put forward then, this notion of substantive equality. But already there, I showed the limits of even substantive equality, even though it's much better than formal equality. But yes, I started off working at UNISA already as a student. I was there as a student assistant. I moved to Pretoria in 1999, worked there for 20 years, 4 years at the Free State, and now I'm here at the UWC. Yes.
Prof, that is a fascinating journey so far. So there's still many more and many moons of this journey. But I want to pick up on something. In more particular, you identify as a critical theorist whose work focuses on critical theory, legal philosophy, and jurisprudence. Why?
All right. So I think specifically, I remember sitting in my first year private law module, sitting there as an 18, 19-year-old with high hopes how the law is going to help me to fight apartheid or install a better life for people. And I was quite disillusioned, thinking, this is not going to do it. But as I said just now, it was through legal philosophy and the really study of law. And many people will say philosophy is not really law because it's too abstract. But it was through studying those abstract ideas that I started realizing the failure, but also the potential of law. So critical theory in South Africa, if we think about the legal academia, we initially was mostly influenced by what we know as sort of American realism that developed into critical legal studies, so sort of US-style critical legal theory that I still draw on. A very famous article that all law students will know is an article authored by Carl Clare, who's a member of the critical legal studies movement, where he suggests this idea of transformative constitutionalism for South Africa. So, of course, this concept has been criticized, also rightly so, but the point is that comes from a certain critical tradition, the US critical legal theory tradition. But I think as things started opening, at least in law, we started to pursue also the other critical traditions, not only the US one. So there's a certain school or movement, problematically called the sort of Brit Euro critique, but coming out of a specific university in the UK, Birkbeck Law, and I had very close contacts with Birkbeck throughout the years. And their work is much more philosophical and influenced by European post-structural philosophers. But then I think more and more lately, then also unearthing critiques from our own continent. So we might talk more about Ubuntu, but I've always tried to think also about this ethic of Ubuntu from a critical perspective. So I think Ubuntu plays also a role to criticize the status quo, sort of a liberal legal order. I've drawn on feminist theory also. So I think that's broadly the various traditions. Maybe to mention, I think, more southern perspectives. So that's also where decolonial perspectives would be important. Developing also out of some of the South American writers like Walter Mignolo, de Souza Santos, but of course also voices from our own continent. So ultimately, I would say I do critical jurisprudence. I don't have formal training in philosophy. So I read philosophy, I engage with philosophy, but where I am, what I think I do and want to do is critical jurisprudence, influenced by, as I say, a number of different critical traditions.
Prof, I can sit here and listen to you speaking all day. I clearly you're a great teacher, because just summarizing all of the very critical traditions and bringing to Ubuntu, which we'll get later on, is amazing. But I want us to focus a little bit more on feminism. And one of the things you say is that you see yourself as an ethical feminist. And most of your work is inspired and embedded in feminist theory. So please explain to me and other people what is ethical feminism and what is an ethical feminist?
So it's very closely related to the critical tradition where I would situate my own work and myself. Of course, feminism, if we think of feminist theory, has been for a long time, but also where we are now, rightly criticized because of a certain version of Western, and let's call it a certain version of white middle-class feminism that became so powerful and that focused only on the experience of one group of women. So ethical feminism then is situated within, if we want to refer to this trajectory of waves. So first wave feminism is your sort of first liberal feminists that were very concerned with sameness, and they wanted to show how women and men are exactly the same. For that reason, they argued it's irrational to exclude women. So they had to insist on sameness. And of course, first wave feminists had some successes. The reason that we all can vote, have rights to vote, we can be in public spaces, in the universities, because of those successes. But in the second wave of feminism, certain practical issues came to the fore. Now women can work, but what to do with them when they fall pregnant? Women, how to deal with reproductive rights in the workspace, how to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. So second wave feminists started to argue that we can't only focus on sameness. We need actually to insist on differences, very real, concrete, material differences between men and women, but also cultural and symbolic differences. And there are many positions in the second wave. But of course, second wave feminists, to some extent, fell in the same trap of working with certain essentialisms. So even if we can say that there are differences between men and women, what about race and ethnicity and language and religion? And also the whole difference between man and woman and they and them, and gendered identities have grown so much. So essentialism, that essentialism of the second wave is really problematic. So third wave could be postmodern feminism, post-structural feminism, post-colonial feminism initially, and decolonial feminism will probably place in a fourth wave, even beyond those. But ethical feminism then was coined by a legal academic and theorist. Her work and herself was very close to my heart, the late Drusilla Cornell. She sadly passed in December, but I started reading her work as an LLB student. I relied on it in my master's and my doctorate. I was privileged enough to get to know her very well. We worked very closely together through the years. So ethical feminism then is inspired by post-structural theory, very specifically the work of a French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, believing in the idea of deconstruction and really in the postponement of meaning. So maybe in direct response to this idea of an essentialist feminism that tried to describe women in a fixed way or man in a fixed way, ethical feminism, we'll say, affirms sexual difference, but not in any essentialist way, to the extent that it is impossible to ever define women in one specific way. So you can see how ethical feminism already opens up for differences also in terms of race and class and religion and so on. Maybe also the ethical part is exactly because of the realization of the impossibility of fixing. So Cornell's first book was Beyond Accommodation, and that's really where she unpacked ethical feminism. But her second book was titled The Philosophy of the Limit. And that was really the term that she used to explain this notion of deconstruction and to work with the importance of a limit, but a limit that also opens up other possibilities. So I think that's more or less where ethical feminism is. So it's definitely influenced by a specific theoretical, conceptual position. But I think how to live or be, or work or teach as an ethical feminist is, of course, to be very aware of patriarchy, to be very aware of male suppression, masculine, the role of masculinity in not only legislation, but in text, in words, in the everyday. Not to be opposed to legal reform, but definitely from an ethical feminist perspective, we'll never believe that legal reform will provide the final or the ultimate answer. So maybe that's enough for now.
Yes, so, but you also co-authored a paper in 2015, which was titled Ubuntu Feminism, Tentative Reflections. So tell us more about Ubuntu Feminism, because like I explained to you, it's rare that you see Ubuntu and feminism together.
So this paper was co-authored with Drusilla Cornell. So we worked together on an Ubuntu project over many years. So Cornell came to South Africa in 2001. She was invited to give a plenary paper. But she was the kind of person who didn't like hanging around only in academic scenes. So her very first visit was to Stellenbosch University, and she ended up skipping some of the sessions sitting in a coffee shop in Stellenbosch, where she started speaking to a waitress who told her about Ubuntu. And she was really inspired and came back to South Africa in 2004 to start the Ubuntu project at the University of Pretoria. And as I say, the two of us worked together for a long, long time. She had a short stint at UCT, but then after UCT, the project continued at UP. So it's important to say this because Ubuntu feminism, in a way, developed from her passion and interest in Ubuntu and the many projects we had. So one of the first things that people will say about Ubuntu is how, as a feminist, can you support Ubuntu? Because Ubuntu is situated in what many people, Western people, but also other people perceive as patriarchal communities. So in, let's call traditional Ubuntu communities, quite often women will play a subordinate role, or at least from the Western gaze, women will play a subordinate role. So if Ubuntu is about this idea that you're only a person through the community or through others, if that community is a community where women play an inferior role, the question will be, where's the space for women? And I think in the Ubuntu project, but specifically also Cornell, really insisted on a different understanding of Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is not only about communitarianism. So it's not that one is only a person through the community, but also, so there is space in an Ubuntu ethic for the individual to develop, but how you develop as an individual is because of the support of the community around you. And drawing on African philosophy, we tried to see how Ubuntu feminism can really respond to many of the problems in Western feminism. So in the US context, Drusilla was very concerned about the sort of continued debates between difference or sameness, or whether one should follow a more liberal or more communitarian ethic. And she believed Ubuntu feminism in a way collapsed the two, because it doesn't make this huge distinction between the community and the individual, because it shows how what one is as a community is so connected to, or as an individual, so connected to the community. Of course, there are other feminists in the Western tradition that argue the same. So in the piece on Ubuntu feminism, we also draw on relational feminism as developed by someone like Jennifer Nadolsky in the US context, and others. In the article on Ubuntu feminism, I also tried to push this notion of Ubuntu as a spatial concept. And if we think about spatial theory, it is important to bring in a feminist or a gendered element also there. So if Ubuntu is about our connections with the community, we understand how Ubuntu is also very much a spatial theory, because these connections happen in a specific space, in a specific place. And if we can then combine this notion of spatiality with community, but in a feminist perspective, the idea it will help us to also think about our spaces where we meet as communities, and to be more aware of the play of gender in those communities. So that's one thing that we opened up in that article that I really would like to pursue further now in the research chair that I've taken up, to do more work on Ubuntu, but specifically then Ubuntu feminism as a spatial concept.
I think that would be a great research project, and even prospect just exploring the possibilities and the limitations of such a framework, and looking at but also tying it into the kind of work that is currently happening at the university after Fees Must Fall, which kind of put a different agenda on the table. Fees Must Fall also talk about Africanization and all of these other things. So in another paper, you argue that Africans should tell the African story. So my question is, normally when people talk about Africans, is what is the story, and whose story is it? Who is the African and who is not the African? So that's the question.
Right. So that was actually a review article on a book that was published on women judges. And the book focused on a number of women who became judges in the international arena, in various international courts, but also regional courts. And so for the book review, I think someone uses the phrase, and I just use that for the title. But of course, what is Africa? And again, we know how so many writers treat Africa in a essentialist and a reductive manner. So Africa is plural. It's multiple, and I don't think we should ever try and reduce it or fix it to a specific definition. It's also dynamic and continuous, and it develops and it responds to many things. But so who should tell the story? I think just more people from here. We had enough people in the West, and during sort of high colonialism, anthropologists who were sort of fascinated with Africa as other, and came and told our stories for us. So in a way, it's really just people from here telling stories, and people have been telling stories. I mean, the oral tradition narrative is so central to how people have been living here traditionally. Even if we think in terms of law, it developed here, African customary law. It's an oral tradition, and the whole notion of codification was a Western sort of input. So maybe just by using that phrase, I was trying to emphasize the importance of storytelling. I think law, in a big way, is also about narrative and telling of stories. But that, well, everyone living here should be able to participate in the story. But maybe the most important thing is that there can never be only one story. So it's about the importance of having plural stories. Maybe at the moment when I walk out of here, I'm going to teach in this program for Missouri students coming here for an exchange, and I'm going to start by referring to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and of course the TRC had its limits, but the one thing that it insisted on is the importance of story and the extent to which it opened up this possibility for everyone to come and share their stories in a public space. So I think what I would like to highlight, maybe just here, the importance of many stories, not only a single story, but that those stories should also be told and be heard in the public.
No, I support the whole statement that Africans should tell their own story. I'm completely behind the idea, because any story told from inward out, give a sense of representation, identity, but bring so much more nuances. And you're rightfully so saying that there is some critical or even theoretical things that essentializes, because then it becomes measurable within the university. So I like your description of Africa, which is dynamic, which is fluid, who's forever changing, and I think we must never go to the kind of essentialized traditions in thinking Africa. So I'm with you on that one. We celebrate this year also 100 years of women in law in South Africa. And I think this is, you're one of the great people to ask this question. What are your reflections on the state of women in the legal profession? Will it be better in the next 100 years?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Because I think when the dean contacted me saying, we're going to celebrate, or there is a big celebration, and the law faculty will play a part, and will you become involved? I said yes, but I'll have to insist on also critical engagement, that this can't be a mere celebration. And it was so wonderful when we had our event at UWC. The famous and lovely poet Diane Ferris came, and she wrote a poem for the occasion. And the last line, and we didn't brief her, we just said, thank you so much for coming. We thought she'll just read any of her poems, and we didn't even know that she's going to write a new poem. But she wrote a poem, and the sort of phrase, the last phrase of the poem was, this is not a celebration, it is an accusation. And I thought, wow, it was almost uncanny that she just immediately sort of picked up on what at least I intended with the day. So of course, not to say that there's nothing to celebrate. I mean, in the same way, when we talk about, South Africa being a young democracy, and we sometimes tend to say nothing has changed. And I don't think that's true. And the same, of course, can be said about women. A lot has changed. The mere fact that there was the Wookie case where someone was successful in convincing the judge that women can join. It took them almost, 10 years, I think, to come up with the legislation. But, of course, here we are. So maybe here it is important to talk about not only sort of institutional change, but change on a symbolic level. And I think that's what decoloniality is also trying to capture. So South Africa, but many other countries might be in a post-colonial context. So it's after institutional colonialism end, or apartheid. We definitely after a institutional system of apartheid, but we know how apartheid endures on so many levels. Same with the issue of women. Yes, we can join the legal profession. We can study law, and we have so many women students. And I mean, I don't have the statistics. I'm not a statistic person, but I think if we really look at, how women students perform, I think often they perform better than the male students. Who, they get the prizes. They walk out, and they maybe even get the articles. But I think more work should be done to trace them 5 years or 10 years later. Who are the partners in the firms? Who are the most successful advocates? Who get the work, and to what extent? Maybe someone might say, but Karin, asking those questions, that's already the wrong questions. Why do you measure women's success in the legal profession by looking at those male yardsticks? So maybe that I should be more critical also in how I view. But the question is, I think women in the legal profession can't function well if the society in which we live keep on treating women in the way we are treating women. So we can talk about socioeconomic conditions, poverty. The poorest of the poor will always be women. So in a way, the violence, that everyday violence of poverty, not having a roof over your head, not having water, not having electricity, enough food, etc. But of course, then the gender-based violence, the femicide, the high rape statistics. So all of these things, I think, unfortunately, influence my view on the success of women in the legal profession. So it's also, the one thing is not only what the legal profession did for women, but how did women in the legal profession really contribute to change? And that's difficult. So if we talk about symbolic violence, and a scholar like Pierre Portal have sort of developed symbolic violence, it's the unseen. And it's those patriarchal forms of oppression that become more normalized, to the extent that it's normal for the oppressor but the oppressed. So we know that, unfortunately, many women, the moment they're in the legal profession, also, in a way, are co-opted, and they stop. If they ever were concerned, but they don't necessarily make the change that they can make. So quite often students will have little projects, and they would say, if we can just have more women judges, then things will go better for women. And I always say, be careful. Of course we need representation. I'm not saying we should not have more women judges or more women in the legal profession. But at the same time, there will only be a change if the people in the system or themselves change. So again, Cornell, she always identified transformation by saying transformation means the change of structures in a system, but it also means that the people themselves within a system must change. Same can, again, be said about apartheid, but definitely everyone in the system will have to change. Not only women, but of course also men. So what do I think? What will happen in 100 years? Will it look better? So I don't want to be only negative and pessimistic. There's always the potential that things can change. I will never give up on that sort of aspiration. But it will only happen if we do, I think, more thinking, more conceptual work. And of course, it talks to the law curriculum and what it is that we teach students, but not only what we teach them, but how we teach. As they walk in, do we only paint a picture of the law firm where they're going to make loads of money? Or do we paint a picture of law as really something that should serve the community, but not only, but should bring about a radical change? So I would say there's hope, there's a possibility that in 100 years things look different, but only if there are certain fundamental changes. Maybe I could just say something about legal culture. I referred to the Clare article earlier on transformative constitutionalism, but the other leg of his article is he's talking about legal culture, saying that law, this constitution, has the potential to bring about radical change in South Africa, but only if there's a change in legal culture. And we're going to have a conference in August, the RULKI, the Research Unit for Legal and Constitutional Interpretation, where we're only focusing on legal culture and to really tease out the extent to which legal culture has changed. And it starts here, it starts in the law faculty, because how we teach, even how we define the law affects legal culture. But of course, we'll also have panels on judges to reflect on legal culture in the profession. So if legal culture can change, if legal education can change, we might have a shift that could mean that in 100 years, things look better for women.
This is so amazing to have this conversation with you, because I think 50% of my friends are lawyers, very close friends, and shame. And two of the most endearing ones that is very close to my heart, both of them are lawyers. One is, and they're married. Both of them moved to Australia. But the one who I identify as a woman had a different experience as her husband. She was the eye candy in many of the legal behind the scenes events, meaning that she can sit in the negotiations, but she didn't have a voice. Yeah. And one of the things that she told me, harrowing story, is that one of the churches here in Cape Town, big church, international church, they had a meeting, and it was a meeting about buying property. And she was not allowed to speak. And it was during the time of COVID. The guy refused to wear a mask. But it was millions, close to 100 million worth of property. And the law firm just put that to the side, let the pastor or whoever he is treat her with disdain. You're not allowed to speak. And in my church, women are not allowed to speak. Yeah. And she had to be on the side. No opinion. So the stories behind the scenes is that, yes, you might make it to the table, but when you get to the table as a woman, you don't have a voice. Yeah. You're just there for the law firm to tick a box and maybe just eye candy. Yeah. You can go with, because you're a woman, and maybe that person will sign the contract. So the stories behind the scenes that my friends are telling me is not one of the best. But let's move on. I also share your view is that there's always a possibility for good. Humanity is thousands of years old, and we have come a long way, and we have become more human or more animal. I don't know, because the way we treat animals is sometimes worse than animals treat other animals. So we're also celebrating next year 30 years of democracy. As a woman in South Africa, what are your reflections on the state of democracy? Will we last another 30 years or will we implode like many African countries?
Sure. Yes. Again, a difficult question. So maybe just one thing to pick up on the previous point is there was a little book project on the work of Justice Albie Sachs that I did with Refusal now, and in my chapter I referred to this idea of law becoming human, thinking that is what I associate with Justice Sachs's work. His attempt to make law more human. Now, of course, in the context of climate change and in animal ethics, one could question the human, but I think what I try to say there is sort of law becoming more ethical, more aware of the other, more opening up, and maybe that is the one possibility for law to become better, do better. So maybe to bring it into democracy, I think probably many people are really worried. We're in a crisis. I mean, I'm just back from a conference. I was in France for the last week, where I participated in a gender-based violence conference at the University of Lille, and just being in a different country, one realizes how one becomes used to certain things that are just not right. Just in terms of course, there were huge student protests, but broad protests in France the past week because of the police who brutally killed. People would have watched the news, and it was interesting to see how young people in France just riot and protested. Sometimes I think maybe going over the line. The tube station opposite the university was burnt, cars burnt. So and I think maybe similar things comparisons to be made with protests in South Africa. That probably could be another film, Jacob, but that's not this one. But I think I realized there just the issue of safety. Even in Lille, where there were huge protests, I felt really safe walking around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night in Paris, a big city. And that's the kind of thing that we feel when we're abroad. In Cape Town, I will not do that. I mean, every time I'm on Robert's book, where I remember, Uber drivers telling me, remember, never put your bag on the seat, put away your cell phone, whatever. So just the level of crime. Also, if you want, as a woman, but it's all, I think men are also under threat. That is not normal. That is not the kind of society we envisioned in the 90s. But of course, the absolute, socioeconomic conditions, coming back, driving from Cape Town Airport, seeing the informal settlements, knowing that it was really cold, really raining, and how many people are still living in those circumstances. So that makes one really worried about the state of democracy, and asking questions about the government and why aren't they doing more. Maybe just another normalized thing, load shedding. I found myself in France quickly thinking, when will there be load shedding? I was checking the schedule and then realizing, no, there's no load shedding here. So there are real issues, and I think, like many other people, I'm worried about that. Why isn't the government fixing it? And I mean, I hate talking about corruption, but we all know that there's a lot of corruption going on. But is there a future? And I'm as someone who teaches law, and I've been working in a law faculty all my life, I need to bring up the Constitution and the possibility of the Constitution to prevail, and South Africa then as a constitutional democracy, will that continue? And I know that there are many critiques on the Constitution, and I know that this version of the Constitution might not be the best one. But I also believe that a Constitution, I always say to students, it's words on paper. Constitution only becomes alive when we apply it. So in teaching legal interpretation, there's a beautiful term of concretization. So Constitution only becomes alive when it's concretized, when you match the Constitution or a specific section in the Constitution with a real life problem. And there, if we can, again, teach our law students, our future lawyers, our future practitioners to deal with the Constitution in a much more open, but I also would say radical way, and read this document as a document that is there to bring about transformation, I think the law can do a lot. It can't do everything. Law is limited. An issue only comes to the courts after many things have happened. Many people will say we don't have access to justice. We just don't have money to find a lawyer to get to this perfect, situation that I'm suggesting. So maybe law, more legal centers, more law clinics. I think practice should open up and have more community engagement projects so that some of the issues maybe can get to the court. So I don't know what's going to happen on a political front. Party politics, in a way, I don't find that even that interesting. I don't want to talk party politics. There's a beautiful distinction made in philosophy between politics and the notion of the political. And I suppose I tend to, in my own work, focus more on the political. So the political is the possibility of politics, the possibility of thinking about a better way of doing things, even than pursuing democracy. So I think I'm worried. We'll have to see, even I think building up to the elections, what is going to happen in the next 8 months. I'm not sure when the elections are. Even load shedding, and I know we don't like load shedding, but we need load shedding, because if we don't have load shedding, Eskom is going to collapse. So I think if we're going to have less load shedding, we probably have to be really worried, because then we know that there's something going on. I don't know if there will be a big sort of dramatic change. And maybe, I don't know if that's even good or bad. Do we want a radical change? Do we want the ANC not to be voted in again? What will the implications be? The alternatives. So in a way, I think we need to. Everyone should just do the best they can. And myself, being an academic in a faculty of law, I can continue teaching law in such a way that I hopefully persuade students that you study law because you want to contribute, because you want to make a change. Studying law in South Africa is not the same as studying law in another place, although there are many problems globally. So I think as South Africans, we should not exceptionalize ourselves. Governments all over the world are corrupt. Luckily, we're not in the US, so that's the positive. So I think if we can just do the best we can, but I would say I would hope that people could develop more of an ethics of care, maybe even embrace more Ubuntu, and then hopefully next year will not be the disaster that we fear.
Prof, we go to our final question. So this is time to look back. So looking back on your career that is dominated by men, what message do you have for young women who want to enter the legal profession or a career in legal thought who want to follow your footsteps?
Yeah. I mean, let me not disencourage women to study law, but I want them to study law for the right reasons. And that should not be because you want to make a lot of money, or because you want to walk around in stiletto heels and Donna Karan suits. I think I would want women to study law, and I mean, it sounds so cliche, but I mean that's the only thing I can say. Law should serve the ideal of justice, and I think I want to encourage and invite future women to study law, because there's this urgency to make a change. Law ultimately is about language, so you need to love language to be able to do law. It is about reading, it's about engaging with texts, and I know many things are electronic, but I still believe you need to go into the library and feel the paper under your fingers. So study law because you love language and you believe in the power of words to change hearts and minds and structures. Study law because you like history. We often have students studying law who say they hate history. You can't study law if you don't like history. You need to believe in the power of the story and stories and narratives to make a change. I would say you need to love thinking, because ultimately law is about how stronger your conceptual thinking is, the better lawyer you can be. So study law for those reasons. Maybe I can just invoke a scholar, Andre van der Walt, who also passed many years ago, but he did wonderful work in the context of constitutional property to show the possibilities of change if we can just move away from our sort of fixed, conservative, capitalist notions of property. But when he wrote about the Constitution, he always said, the Constitution shows us that things can be different, not necessarily better. And I think that's the first step. You want things to be different. You shouldn't believe that things should stay exactly as they are. So you must be someone who wants to almost embrace change, but because you want things to be different. And then I think, come and study law at UWC, and hopefully, there will be a possibility to change things. Women should believe in themselves. They should really, believe in their own voice. I think quite often women allow also men to speak for them or to speak over them. So you'll have to be strong. You'll have to be insistent. You don't need to be like a man. You don't need to be sort of dominant or aggressive. You need to use your mind, but I think be sort of stubborn and in your position. And then I think the study of law could be really valuable, and also ultimately it will be valuable because you can make a contribution to the South African society, but also to the world. I'll just finally say something about world making. I think one of the theorists that I rely on a lot in my work is she was a German Jewish philosopher who had to flee from Germany to the States, Hannah Arendt. And she was she always spoke about or wrote about the importance of being in the world. And she was very critical to people who sort of had the sense of a loss of the world. And that's how she actually defined totalitarianism. And of course, we know that apartheid was in a way an example of totalitarianism. She wanted people to be worldly, to be part of a world So I think see yourself as part of, and of course we know that there are many worlds, but see yourself as a part of a world from where you can contribute to many worlds, to a pluriverse.
Prof, thank you very much. It was an honor to have this conversation with you, and I am certain that people listening to it, both men and women, will find an inspiration from your words. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.